It's now my pleasure to introduce a colleague from the University of Maryland, Jim Gates. Those of you who saw some of the presentations will know that there's an odd thing about UTeach, which is that if you look at which discipline has contributed the most co-directors, yes, it's physics. Everybody in physics in the audience, raise your hands. All right, let's hear it for physics. We're small but important in the scientific community. And Jim Gates is neither small nor unimportant in the scientific community. He's a University System Regents Professor, the John S. Toll Professor of Physics at the University of Maryland, College Park, and he's the director of the Center for String and Particle Theory. He serves on many important national panels. He's on the Presidential Council of Advisors on Science Technology, which is one of the main ways that scientists can influence national policy and inform the president about what he has to know about where science and technology are going. He got 2 BS degrees and a PhD from MIT, and when he got his PhD at MIT, I think it was a relatively long trek, but that was because he was one of the very first people to appreciate the significance of a dramatically new approach to understanding the fundamentals of matter, supersymmetry. And perhaps it seemed slow at first, but by the time he left as a graduate student, he was one of the world's experts on this topic, and I think it's a testament to persistence and also to great judgment that he figured out as a graduate student an area that would turn out to be so profoundly significant and then invest time in it so that he became acknowledged as a world leader in this area. In 2012, he was named as a University System of Maryland Regents Professor, and he's the 6th person to get that honor since 1992. I actually saw him about 2 weeks ago in Washington. He had the honor of being elected to the National Academy of Sciences, which is one of the nation's great honors, and he is apparently first African American to be elected to that, which perhaps reflects on the National Academy as well as other things, but he is truly an extraordinary person and has opened many doors. He was also awarded the Medal of Science by President Obama and was awarded that in a ceremony in 2013. So it's a great honor to have him here. He's going to give us a 3 or 4 hour lecture on supersymmetry now, and we look forward to hearing it. Thank you.
Well, good evening. Let's try that again. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank Michael for that kind introduction. I have a standard story that I tell people about introductions, so I'll share it with you. Some people in the audience have probably heard it before. That was a beautiful introduction because of its brevity. And I do a lot of speaking, and so we've developed a document that contains information on anything that we can figure out an introduction might wish to include. But we don't wish for people to use the entire document. So on more than one occasion, we have sent this document to a venue, a collection of hosts, and the message about pick out a few interesting things was somehow not effectively transmitted. And on one such occasion, I was sitting next to a friend, and the person reading the introduction decided to work their way through the entire document, which of course is A, embarrassing for me, B, tiring for the audience, and C, probably tiring on the person doing the reading. But nonetheless, they persisted and they got all the way to the end. And my friend who was sitting next to me said, "You know, Jim, we've all heard of a person that needs no introduction." But that is an introduction that needs no person. So I thank Michael for that brief introduction. I do have one correction to make, however. I am not the first African American elected to the Academy. I'm the first African American physicist elected to the Academy. Michael and I, in fact, had a brief conversation about the induction ceremony, which happened about a month ago. And I have to tell you that I never imagined that I would become a member of the Academy. It's, you know how for students, you first get your undergraduate degree, so you get a bachelor's degree. And then if you go to graduate school, you work your way towards a master's degree. Or maybe you're working towards a PhD. Well, you might think that once you become a professor, this process ends. You would be wrong. Because in fact, becoming a member of the Academy felt just like I finally graduated as a professor. So you didn't invite me here to talk about all of this trivia. So let's get started on our journey. One thing that I wanted to say is, before I begin, is as I look out at an audience like this, and as I've had a chance to talk with a few people and look in on some of the sessions and what have you, you folks are the realization of a dream. Let me start back up a bit. The reason this administration has such an interest in STEM education is because this is an interest of your president. I was utterly stunned when I realized that the President of the United States thought that the issue of STEM education was of such importance that he wanted to have a direct impact on the issue. This is the first president that we have had in the history of the country who has had this specific interest. So that's part of the reason why I'm a member of a group called PCAST, and we're going to meet our membership later. But it stems directly from the president's interest. So although you are a very beautiful group to look at, I would ask, do you really know who you are? Now you might say, oh yeah, I'm from such and such a campus and such a place. But that's not the question I'm really asking when I ask, do you really know who you are? Because collectively, you are something that is very vital to the future of this country. And I want to try to give a story and situate you in that story so that you can come to know who you are. So my title, as you can see, is the third STEM crisis. So why is this a third STEM crisis? Well, as I read the history of our country, technology has come to our country's rescue on at least two previous occasions. One of those previous occasions turns out to be the Civil War, because in fact, it spurred an enormous development of technology in the nation. The Second World War, in fact, also had a similar effect, speeding up the pace at which technology was developing. And each of those was a crisis. Both of those perhaps were existential crises for our country. But we, as a country, survived and overcame those challenges, and now we have a third such challenge. And the reason I compare to these two is because the magnitude, in my mind at least, is of a similar nature. So I'm going to start off by telling you a fairy tale that is rooted, in fact, in history. Now, many people have heard this book by Friedman called The World is Flat. But I've concluded that, in fact, the Atlantic Ocean has been flat for even a longer time. There's this wonderful book that tells the story. It's a book called The Race Between Education and Technology by Claudia Golden and Lawrence Katz. And I would recommend that any of you, if you have the time, you should read this book so that you can, I'm going to give you a Reader's Digest version, but it will tell you a story about why what you're doing is so important to what's happening for our country's future. It's a story about a race between two countries. The two countries are ours and Great Britain. In the 1830s, this is a plot that essentially shows the size of the national economic prowess of each country, or the domestic product, as we used to call it. And back in the 1830s, the United States was, in terms of wealth, was worth about 30 to 40% of the national economy of Great Britain. Now, something very interesting started happening in the United States. We're the first country that figured out a certain secret, and that secret is, in fact, directly tied to what you're doing here and who you are. That secret is that if you invest in the education of your population, that translates into wealth. We're the first country, apparently, who figured this out. In the 1830s, something called the Common School movement arose, and it was the effort to say that every child should get at least up to a 6th grade education. So you can see, well, we didn't have as much money as the English, but we had this idea. And then what's really interesting is about 20 years later, we had the world's best educated workforce. Now, we weren't still as wealthy as the English, but as you can see, we're roughly about half the size of the economy of Great Britain. But we continued. And one of the interesting things about our continuance in this process is the Mayoral Act of 1862. In the middle of the Civil War, think about it, when the question of whether the country would continue to exist, our leadership in the Congress said, we will invest in the American people, and created the public land grant university system. To me, this is an amazing amount of insight, that in that environment, you're thinking about the future and having the confidence to say that the American people are going to make a brighter future and we can assist them. There was a second Mayoral Act in 1890, and this one was really interesting for those of us who are minority folks, because you see, the first Mayoral Act, although it created the great land grant system in the nation, was only directed to our citizens of European descendants, not to the entire population. So this second Mayoral Act is one that created the public HBCU system in this country. And what's interesting to me is that you can see this is in 1890 that this happened. That means that there was an awareness in the country, even that long ago, of the need for a broad, diversely educated population, which is astounding. Now, many people like to think that for the African American community, the struggle for access to quality education began in the much later with the civil rights movements and what have you. And so I'll tell you a little story. In 1845, a whaling captain by the name of Absalom Boston had a daughter. And he lived on Nantucket Island, and in order to continue the education, there was a school that had a set of admissions tests. His daughter sat for those admission tests and scored higher than any student who took the tests. But on the basis of her race, because she was an African American, she was denied admission. Now remember, this guy is a whalership captain. I always like to have the image of Gregory Peck and Moby Dick with a real good tan. So you can imagine this guy who's used to hunting down whales is not going to stand still for his daughter to be treated like this. And so he brought a lawsuit. And it's the first lawsuit that I can find in the history of our nation on the issue of access to education for an African American. So our citizens have understood collectively for an extremely long time in all of our communities why education is of such importance. But we didn't stop there. In the early 1900s, around 1910, the high school movement began. One of its heroes was Horace Mann in New England, which pushed the bar up again. No longer was 6th grade education considered sufficient. We now said every child had to be educated to at least 12th grade in order to participate in the American dream. In 1944, the GI Bill came along. That opened up university educations to far more people than had ever gone to universities and colleges beforehand. And then in 1958, there was a National Defense Education Act. Most of you young people have never heard of that, but people with gray hair like me, we know, I see my friend over there laughing about it, we know all about the NDEA because that's how we funded our educations in technical fields in this country. It was the first time that the federal government decided that a focused investment in technologically based fields was in the interest of the country as a whole. And so it funded people to go to college to study technical fields. Now, 58 was an interesting year because if you stop and think about it, you might ask, why did it happen then? Well, there was this little thing called Sputnik. It's frightened the devil out of our country. Other interesting things happened that same year. DARPA, who most of you may know something about, was created as a consequence of Sputnik. And for those of you who don't know who DARPA is or the organization, I'd like to point to things like GPS, that came from DARPA. I'd like to point to night vision, that's a DARPA development. In fact, the thing that you probably use most that you don't know where it came from is the internet. Because it was DARPA-funded research that set in place the basic technology by how the internet works, all from this one little agency that you've never heard about, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. But every time you look at this story, it's because the country as a whole is investing in education because it's an investment in the people to build a better lives for themselves. Now, the 1900 early high school movement was also occurring as the country was making the shift from the farm to becoming an industrialized society centered in great cities. And so you could imagine going back in a time machine and encountering someone who said, well, gee, why do I have to send my child to get more years of education? I'm not interested in having my child become a poet, an author, someone who becomes a book reader. Why do I want that? And of course, the problem with that view on the point of education is that's not why you're sending your child to school. And also note that the government is usurping some of your rights, because up until that point, you had the right to keep your child out of school. And so when people start talking about the exchange of what the government does versus what we as citizens of this country have, you need to think very carefully about the implications of the balance of where those rights go. Was this a good thing to remove the rights of parents to not send their children to school? Was it a bad thing? I think looking back in hindsight, I think we can figure the answer out. So one needs to be very careful in addressing these questions about what it is that we give up versus the benefit for the nation as a whole. So how does STEM, because I often speak to audiences that are less well trained and educated as yourselves. And so I often get the question, why do you people keep pushing this STEM thing so much? Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Why do you keep doing that? Because after all, we did just fine, right? And it's usually mature people who say that my generation did just fine without that. And so I'd like to tell a story. Most of you probably have some wireless device attached to your body somewhere. You might wonder how it got there. It didn't crawl up your leg. So where do wireless devices come from? Well, turns out they come from 4 equations, essentially. Now, I know that's hard to believe, right? Because people think mathematics is just it's like philosophy, right? Totally useless thing that sits out there in its enormous, brilliant perfection and has no implication for how our world works. That's a view that many of our fellow citizens have. They think it's like poetry, philosophy, right? But mathematics is actually quite different when it is married to the issue of describing how reality works. And that's what people who are scientists, physicists in particular, folks like me, I started dreaming about becoming a scientist at age 4, but that's another story. But when you marry mathematics with trying to understand nature, a very powerful force is unleashed, and that power is the force of the human imagination. Now, these equations make a prediction, which I'm going to show you next. In the center of that illustration is an electron. When I move it, there's some kind of hair that moves with it that you just saw. Now, before these equations were written, no one ever had that idea. People knew about charges. There was Coulomb laws, but no one had the idea that when you take an electron and move it, there's a form of invisible hair around it that moves with it. The person who first figured this out was James Clerk Maxwell. We call these the Maxwell equations that you see in front of you. I like to call them the beeper cell phone equations, because that's where the stuff came from. Because you see, when Maxwell made this prediction that if you take a magnet and some batteries and do something to it and create this little ball of electricity that is capable of flying outside of the wires, that's a powerful idea. That's a new idea. And so a little bit later, a German physicist by the name of Heinrich Hertz heard of this idea and said, if these balls of invisible electricity are just flying around through space, I ought to be able to measure them. And he did. Now, most people never heard of Heinrich Hertz, but they know the expression megahertz, right? Megahertz, that's how measurement of how fast your computer operates. The Hertz is Heinrich Hertz's last name. It's in honor, as a result of measuring these invisible pieces of electricity. The next part of the story you may have heard is something about a guy named Marconi came along and said, gee, I can use those little invisible balls to send messages back and forth. That's where you get radio. And once you get radio, there's a direct line from there to all the wireless devices and the apps that you folks love so very much. That's what STEM does. It unleashes the power of the imagination to create new inventive structures in our universe that we didn't know existed. So we get computers, we get telephones, and ultimately we get flat panel displays. We get the internet, we get the World Wide Web, all unleashed from this power of the human imagination when we marry our imagination to mathematics and then ask questions about the universe in which we exist. But it has an even more profound effect on us. Because once you get technology like this, then you can start really having fun. You can invent things like YouTube and Facebook, the Wikipedia. And I'm a teacher. I'm in my 42nd consecutive year in the classroom. And I can tell... Thank you. And I can tell you, my students, the students coming to me now are different than they were 10, 15 years ago. And the thing that I suspect has contributed most of this difference is the connectivity that these students experience in every single day of their life. People my generation often refer to them as digital natives, right? I mean, we're an immigrant into this land of digital technology. They were born into it. They are digital natives. Now, you can see it in different effects in teaching because if you actually watch young people today, they're different in so many ways. They're more collaborative, and that comes, I think, from this socialization in terms of what the internet does in binding one mind to another. They communicate they have these really super developed thumbs. Right? So they're very communicative. They have this strange language. If you watch a group of young people make a decision, and in classrooms you give projects to groups, it's interesting these days to watch the dynamics of how decision gets made in these groups. So you can see that something different is going on, and a lot of us think it's the digital revolution that is rewiring the way people think, assimilate information, exchange information, evaluate, and then create new information on top of that. And all because we know how to have something like the internet and the web. I'm a college professor, so I'm going to give you a warning. Here comes your pop quiz. So in 1876, something was invented so that by 1965, there were 150 million users. What was that thing? Telephone. 89 years. In 1928, there was something that was invented so that by 1966, it had 150 million users. What was that thing? Television. In 1983, there was something that was invented so that by 1997, it had 150 million users. What was that thing? Computer? Cell phone. In 2001, there was something invented so that by 2008, it had 150 million users. Any takers? And in 2004, there was something invented so that by 2009, there were 150 million users of this technology. Facebook. Now, the story behind this is actually that you can use these as benchmarks to see that the rate of innovation is accelerating. This is a very important fact to understand about our place in history, that the rate of innovation itself is accelerating. I borrowed this particular pop quiz from Mary Kolanami, who was at IBM. I think it's one of the most powerful things I've seen to explain to general audience what you mean by the acceleration of innovation, because these are things that touch people's lives. So what else has changed? Well, I told you we were the first country to figure out something about education, investing in people leads to wealth. So let's look at that a little bit. We're not doing so hot these days. This is a plot of scores, of American scores on math and science education in the OECD 2010 PISA exams. And if you look at that, you can see that in the red there, you'll find the USA. As you can see, there are a number of countries that score more highly than we do in both math and science, but there we are. Now, we're not number one in this list, that's clear. Looks like we might be about number 21 or so. How many Americans do you know like to run around yelling, "We're number 21"? Right? That's not the way Americans roll. We're not number 21, right? We're number one. But, to be number one is like holding a position as a championship football team or basketball team. It's something that every year you have to win again. It's not a lifetime conferred title on you. You have to win this thing every year. Let's look at it a different way. This is again some relatively old data, this is from 2008, but if you look at the college completion rate among all the countries in the world, you can see that the United States was rated as number 3. Well, it's not number 1, but it's not number 21, so looks pretty good in some level. Now this is for workers aged 25 to 64. If we look at workers aged 25 to 34, look at what happens. We fall to number 9. And if you stop and think about it, this is a frightening statistic because this is the first time in over 100 years that the current generation of youngest workers in our workforce are less well educated than the workers in the generation just prior to them. In a century, this statement could not be made about our country. So our scores aren't very good. We're sort of losing the race in education. We're still having a hard time struggling to explain to our society why this is an important issue. We still struggle with that every day. I know that you do. I know I do. I have friends and relatives who are not in academia, and they say, "Well, why do you keep telling us about this STEM stuff? Why is that important?" Well, it turns out that evidence for why it's important is starting to emerge. Our test score gaps seem to be showing up in our society as wage gaps. There's an excellent report by Tony Carnevale at Georgetown. He heads an institute there. I recommend that you watch regularly because he does wonderful analysis with statistics telling us what's going on with the country. This one report was called The Undereducated American, which I found very interesting. He plotted what he called a wage premium. Now, this is the percentage that someone who earns a college degree, the percentage of their lifetime earnings that's greater than someone who earns a high school degree. And he goes back to the year 1915, and what you can see is in 1915, having a college degree meant you made a lot more money. And the wage premium was about 89%. Now, if you stop and think about it, it's easy to figure out why. There were few people in 1915 getting college degrees. Those that did get college degrees were either doctors or lawyers, right, principally, or other professionals. So they're a small cadre, but they command almost twice the lifetime earnings of a citizen who doesn't have that degree of education. And the interesting thing is that the wage premium drops So that it becomes from the period of 1915 to 1950, in fact, having a college degree was less important to one trying to make a living in the United States. Now, the 1950s are regarded by many people as a golden age in our country. I was born in 1950, so I'm a 1950 kid. I kind of remember what the country was like towards the latter part of that. We were confident as a nation that we could build a brighter future for ourselves. But I have to tell you that this swag, we're kind of letting it down some. About 5 years ago, I went to China for the first time. How many people here have been to China? I recommend every single one of you, if you have the opportunity, go. You have got to see this. I was walking around Beijing, and there was something about watching the people around me that struck me as something I had seen before, something I had felt before. And when I finally figured it out, it was because it felt like walking in an American city in the 1960s when we still had our swag about us, when we knew that we were going to do something very special and good in the future. And now I claim that this attitude is something you can detect if you go to China. That this is a country whose citizens believe that the future is theirs. Now, I'm not one of these people who says we should just close down all the international competition, that globalization is a horrible thing. I don't believe that for a moment. And part of the reason I don't believe that's rather interesting, because although globalization has hurt us as a country, it has done remarkable things around the world. Globalization has allowed China to create about a 300 million person middle class more rapidly than any country in the history of the world. I think it matters. I think the world is a better place, that there is a large, substantial middle class in a country like China that may act as a stabilizing influence as we move into the future. I think that's a good thing. But the downside is that we, in some sense, we funded that. Most people don't know that between 2000 and 2011, on average, 17 factories a day in this country closed. Think about that. Factories, not people getting fired, 17 factories a day closing. That's part of what we're suffering with now. Those jobs did go to other countries. They went to China. And guess what, folks? Those jobs aren't coming back. Those kinds of jobs are not ever going to come back to the United States. And that's part of why our economy is in the situation it is today. A lot of people like to say, oh, it was the crash of 2008 that did this to us. No, it wasn't. That was just sort of the final crescendo of a process that had been underway for about 20 years. And now we're at this place where we got to figure it out all over again. One of the things that I believe about my country is something that was, one of its formulation was stated by Winston Churchill. He said that you can count on Americans to find the best possible solution to any problem after they have tried everything else. Our country, if you read our history, at least as I read our history, we do something I like to call counterpunching. We get knocked on our bottoms, really bad sometimes. And then we dust ourselves off as a nation, and we get up and we find a way to make a better future. This was our pattern during the Second World War with a devastating attack on Pearl Harbor. There are lots of other incidents. You can look at this country where something terrible happens, and then Americans find a way to make it better. So we're in the process of trying to do that one more time as a nation, to create a brighter future for millions of Americans so that we can have this American dream that is perhaps the sweetest dream that has ever been dreamt by our species. To have this dream sustained into the future. And many of us who have looked at this problem have concluded there is a pathway to get there. And you, every single one of you, is part of how we will get there. Now, this wage premium is very weird. Unfortunately, this doesn't show up so well, but this difference in education shows up in people's paychecks these days. And one of the interesting things this is an image that I got from the New York Times, but it shows up in strange ways because a dishwasher with a college degree makes more money than a dishwasher without a college degree. And I can't explain to you why that's a true statement. You can project the course in which jobs are going to be developed. And the kinds of jobs that we see developing for the country in the future are different from the jobs that we see in the past. The jobs that we see in the future, well, one way I like to characterize them is by giving a specific example. How many people in this room know what computer numerical control, the expression computer numerical controls, you know what that refers to? Very few people like us know these things. However, if you were running a large manufacturing concern in the Midwest right now, you would probably know what computer numerical controls are because you see, it's a technology that allows workers to program computers to work in factories. Now, if you stop and think about that, that's really interesting because in order to get a job in a factory now, it's not that you have to be big and brawny because we have robots that can do that. But you've got to be someone who knows how to work with the technology to tell the robots what to do. That means that probably knowing a little bit of algebra and thinking abstractly might be of value. Knowing how to understand some mathematical precision might be of some value. And all of this gets rolled up in computer numerical controls, and people who run manufacturing concerns in our country persistently say that there are at least several 100,000 jobs in this country that are like that they cannot find Americans to employ. And that's why STEM education is important. You see, a lot of people think that when we talk about STEM education, we're talking about producing people like me. You know, a PhD, a professor. I'm one of the most useless people you're going to ever run into. At least as a physicist. I'm one of these guys that writes weird things like superstring theory that was mentioned in the introduction. Is it going to be useful? I don't know. It's my attempt to do something useful. It's my attempt to try to be like Maxwell. The odds are that I'm going to fail. But if no one tries to do this, there are no more Maxwells. And if there aren't any more Maxwells, you cannot imagine breakthrough technologies on the order of a century that matter to this country. So someone's got to do this, but we're relatively useless. But what is useful is the skill set that we possess and inculcating that skill set more widely in the American population so that we could have more Americans who could do those jobs that require computer numerical controls. Now, that means there's something very interesting that's going on in our economy. We all have probably heard about climate change. And there are people who tell you that climate change was a conspiracy invented by Vice President Gore so that he could win the Nobel Prize. But there are other pieces of evidence that perhaps that's not right, and that climate change is occurring, and that it appears that we are likely a substantial cause. But in our economy, there's a kind of climate change going on. Those kinds of jobs I told you about that were left, those were the jobs that sustained the American middle class. That was the climate in which the 50s and 60s up to the early 70s existed in this country, where you could get out of high school, get a great job, raise a family, buy a house, send your children to college, all without engaging in the kind of skill set that comes from studying STEM. Those days are gone. And if we're going to sustain the American dream, then we've got to make sure that those skill set is widely propagated in the American people. STEM skills are percolating through our society. This computer numerical control example that I gave you is just one example of that, where people who, people like I said, people like me, pretty useless, college professors, they do some weird mathematics. There are other people who are more useful to society, but the skill set keeps percolating. That's the important thing to keep keep your eyes on. It's the skill set that is becoming more important. And this skill set allows some people, this is rather busy, so let me just tell you what the big story is here. People with STEM skill sets tend to have lower rates of unemployment. Conversely, people with lack STEM skill sets tend to have higher rates of unemployment. And this is true across a broad variety of fields. Let me move past some of the statistics. Sometimes I get in arguments with people. I bring a battery of statistics to try to get the point across. So let me move past some of these statistics. So where are we going? Quo vadis, where are we going? Well, we keep getting persistent warnings. Rising above the gathering storm, revisited, rapidly approaching Category 5, a fairly old report now. It had a wonderful set of factoids, about 10 pages of just little pithy things that are true about the United States. And so I've got one of the pages here, and this is one I find really interesting because it has a single quote. The United States graduates more majors in visual and performing arts than it does engineers. Now, I made a similar presentation at a university a few years ago, and at the end of my presentation, a professor in the performing arts came up to me and said, "What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? They're all getting degrees." I don't have to explain to this audience what's wrong with that picture. All degrees are not worth the same in terms of the marketplace. And in particular, engineering and science, as I heard one of my mentors many years ago say to me, Abdus Salam was his name, he called physics the wealth-making science. That wealth comes from exploiting these sciences. Now, you can become Jay-Z and Beyonce if you wish. Well, if you're lucky. And you will indeed personally attract wealth to yourself, but you do not increase the net wealth of the society. And you see, there's an equation that drives this all. Our population is increasing. If the wealth is not as increasing, at least at the rate of our population, on average, we all get poorer. It's very simple mathematics. And so, wealth attraction is different from wealth creation. And the models that we see that foster wealth creation all involve STEM. Not attraction, but creation of net wealth. So that's what you folks are doing. You're the people who are fighting for your children and grandchildren and your great-grandchildren, nieces and nephews, to have access to the American dream as people like me and you have lived it up to this point. This country has been a miracle. It has allowed all sorts of things to occur that no other country in the world has ever had happen before. If this country is to continue to be a place of miracles for the vast majority of its citizens, then we have to put in place structures that will allow that to happen. And that's what you are doing. That's what happens when you open up the mind of young people to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. You're putting in place the bridges that can carry those young people to the American dream in this new millennium. The other thing that's important to realize is we as a people are changing extremely dramatically. The demographics of our country will be very different within a relatively short time. I have to tell you a story about my father. My father died in 2007. He was one of my best friends. And one day I was visiting him before his death, and he lived in Orlando, Florida, and we were riding along. And there were a group of young black men on a corner, obviously not gainfully employed. And my father looked at me and said, "Oh, son, that's just so terrible." And I thought to myself, when did Dad get so empathetic? And I said, "So Dad, why is that so terrible?" He says, "Son, they're not contributing to my Social Security." Something else is going on, and that's different. We are living in a world where for the first time in history there will be more old people than young people. This is a dramatic change. Never in the history of our species has this been true. Now this means that, old gray-haired folks like me, we're losing a step. We're probably not as productive as we used to be. And yet there are more of us ever than before. What kind of burden then does that place on the young people of the country? Not only do they have to be productive, they have to be productive at higher rates because we're weighing them down, folks. So we have to enable their ability to innovate. We have to enable their ability to be entrepreneurial. We have to enable their ability to drive an economy in the face of globalized competition. And again, that's who you folks are. If I think of you as an army, you're the army that's doing that. So the Great Recession we've talked about, again, like I said, I want to push to the end because I just have a few more things I want to say. Technology is killing jobs, but it's not doing it the same everywhere. In fact, our country is rather strange because if we were states as opposed to a single country, about 20 of our states would be the most innovative, productive entities in the world. It's only in the aggregate that we tend to lag the world. And you can see this in terms of our educational performance, the PISA. All the red stripes you see there are states of the United States. So the lowest performing governmental entity in the United States in terms of PISA is the District of Columbia, followed by Alabama, New Mexico. This is where we're lagging. On the other hand, the good news part of the story is that you can see that the green line is the average of all participants in PISA. Look at how many red bars there are that reach above that. So we're not lagging everywhere. We just have to find a way to, in the aggregate, get our country together so that we can outperform other nations. Driverless car. Let me give you an exercise in the use of imagination. I don't know how many of you want driverless cars or don't. Sometimes I do, late at night when I'm driving home from work somewhere. But let me put a new thought perhaps for you. What about driverless long-haul freight trucks? What would that do? Well, first of all, driving long-haul freight trucks is probably simpler than driving in the city. So it's probably more efficient to do long-haul freight than cars. But you know there are about 3.2 million people in America who make their living from driving long-haul freight. Do you think they're simply going to lay down and say, we're obsolete? This is the kind of problem our country is going to be facing as we look at the new technologies that are coming in. What can be done? Well, I've alluded to it all throughout this talk. You folks are what can be done. Henry Ford kind of figured this out too, a long time ago. He said, basically, he paid his employees. Everyone knows about mass production, but another thing, an innovation that Ford did was you pay your employees in such a way that they can make you rich. You pay them at the level where they can sustain wealth. So today, it's going to be about education playing the same role. We have got to put the foundation in for our population, have the education that will allow them to be creators of wealth. What you're doing is going to be in an environment that plays out with issues like the Common Core state standards, which is, we see pushback from. About a month ago, I had to testify before the Maryland State Assembly because we have people in my state who don't wish to see the Common Core implemented because they think it's some kind of plot that is an attack on their belief system. Remember earlier we talked about the fact that when you start making people go to school, you're taking rights away. So yeah, they are right in the sense that, yeah, this is kind of like that. There's the next generation science standards that, again, is along the same lines. It's trying to up this average score of the country to be able to create wealth. So a lot of us are on the battle line. In fact, maybe more of you on that battlefront than me, and trying to make sure that our fellow citizens understand what's going on with Common Core, with Next Gen, And it's not an attack on their faith. It's not an attack on their belief system. So 3 years ago, actually 5 now, I was asked to serve on the U.S. President's Council of Advisors of Science and Technology. And I was shocked because I knew what PCAST was, and I never expected to be invited to serve on such a body. We're a group of 20 American citizens with unusual access to the workings of the federal government. We're not part of the government, so when we speak about things, we're private citizens. We can't speak for the government. We can't demand that the government do things. We can only advise. And since we have an enormous pay rate, we have a special title. We're called Government Special Employees. It means that we get paid at the rate of $0 per hour. So you know what you're free to do with advice for which you pay $0 an hour. So we can only say, we can't demand. But in fact, in the STEM domain, the president has authorized, and we have completed 2 reports. And the first one was called To Prepare and Inspire. Now, PCAST is not a debating society. People think that we get together in a room and put big brains together and wonderful thoughts come out. That's not how it works. PCAST is actually an organization that's a think tank that's charged by the president to go out in the country and look for the best ideas that exist in our society and bring those to the attention of the federal government and thereby perhaps get them to be brought to scale. So when we completed our first report on STEM education, and this is its cover page, one of the things that we were looking for were successful models. And that's how we found you. You teach. 17 years old now, if I remember correctly. We had 7 major recommendations in our report, but one of them was to create 100,000 great STEM teachers in 10 years. And that's you. That's what we want you to do for the country. We had looked at the record that UTeach had established up until the period of 2010, and it was you were the only thing we found in the entire nation that had a record of verifiable evidence that you made a difference. The country's actually counting on you in a way that few citizens are ever called on to perform for this great nation of ours. That's what our report did. We asked that you be brought to scale across the country. We're very happy to see UTeach as a growing effort across the country. We use the power of the bully pulpit, the president does, to cajole organizations and philanthropic groups to look at you especially as a model that is worthy of investment. And it's been happening, apparently. We've watched your growth. And I'm going to call out my friend Art Popper, who is over here at this rowdy table of Marylanders, because it was, as mentioned here, we now have UTeach on our campus. Now, I have to tell you that I'm extremely happy about that, because although I was one of the authors of this report, people would then come back and ask me and say, well, what's UTeach look like on your campus? And I would have to say, but now I don't have to do that any longer. We're now part of your family, and I'm extremely happy about that. So we went through a series of recommendations, and as I said, in the interest of time, I'm going to try to skip an enunciation of the recommendations specifically. I'm happy to add in the Q&A to go back and talk to people in detail about this, but as you can see, UTeach, we held it high for the country to see. So, when we do reports, like I said, it's not a bunch of folks going in a room. We go talk to people. Some of the people that worked on our first report were people like Bruce Alberts, probably known to some of you. Deborah Lowenberg Ball, probably also known to some of you. Dennis Bartels up in the Northeast. Linda Curtis Bay, Linda Roberts, Steve Pruitt. If you've been working with Achieve the Next Gen, you know who Steve Pruitt is. So these are the people that develop these kinds of recommendations for the President's Commission, at least as an initial stage. Let me end by coming back to something. Oh, I should say, well, we meet with the President 2 to 3 times a year. It's a very strange feeling to be a citizen in the White House meeting with the President of the United States. I'm not quite sure yet how I feel about that.
The thing that got me interested in mathematics was Mrs. Finkel, this amazing teacher in high school.
The teachers that captured my interest the most were the ones that were able to combine a skill in explanation of things with the ability to do demonstrations or draw me into some form of participation.
There's one central person that I can identify almost immediately, and that was a high school physics teacher, Mr. Freeman Coney. God, that guy loved physics. And not only did he love the discipline, he was able to transmit that to those of us who were sitting in the classroom who actually wanted to listen to what was going on.
When you have a teacher that has a passion for science, that really is inspiring to students.
One gets motivated at different points along the way in one's life by different people. And my parents were my greatest and my first inspiration.
When I was 11, I read Rachel Carson's other book, The Sea Around Us, and discovered the magical world of the ocean and resolved then and there that I was going to be a marine biologist.
It's not just enough to encourage young girls to enjoy science and go into it. They've got to have good teachers, and they've got to have people who can inspire them and show them role models and make it fun for them.
I always remember one thing Mr. Albrecht told us. He said, wiggle your ears before you wiggle your pencil. He meant think hard before you write something down.
What was particularly inspiring about these teachers was that we would have classes of 60 or 70 students, and yet they would still find time, usually on weekends, to take those of us who wanted to learn more, to find laboratories where we could actually use equipment that the high school didn't have.
It's these synergies between students and professors that produces great science, new discoveries. So it's a combination, doing science and learning and teaching.
I will never forget the teachers I have.
Inspiration is important, understanding the beauty of something is important, but hard work, and even brilliant people work very hard to do great things.
There's a special joy that comes from discovering something that no human being has ever known before on the planet, that it's hard to describe unless you've done it.
Understanding how the process is really done, I think is more important than the things that you actually learn.
A handful of extraordinary teachers were very, very important in just giving me the self-confidence to pursue science in an exciting way.
There's nothing like a great teacher. My high school physics class was something that I found riveting.
Teachers are such a key role to the foundation of what one does in one's entire life. And certainly as a scientist, I think most of us can point back to say 1, 2, or 3 people who absolutely were the foundation of our scientific background.
There's no substitute for a great teacher. And if you're asking me who are our national living heroes in this country, it's teachers.
We can't top that, can we? So with that, I'd like to thank Jim Gates profoundly.